Our speaker this evening is a rare beast, I suppose. He's, like myself, he's a battlefield guide. But unlike myself, he's actually employed to do this role on a permanent basis by the National Trust of Scotland. He went to university for his undergraduate studies at Lampeter, which is somewhere in West Wales, which I don't think anybody can find. Only has 200 odd students. So it's quite a unique place. But then decided that he would do his MA at the University of Glasgow under the stewardship of Professor Tony Pollard, where he studied battlefield archaeology. He discovered about a year later, have gone to his to the University of Winchester, which is where he hails from originally, because that was the second, I think, university that brought battlefield archaeology into the syllabus. But he's here to speak to us this evening on the Scots Army of the 17th century, something he knows almost personally as another one of these mad reenactors. Not only a reenactor of the 17th century, but of medieval warfare as well. So with no further ado, let me please introduce to you Warwick Louth. Warwick, over to you.
Thank you very much, Dudley. Well, good evening, ladies and gents, and thank you for joining us. Obviously, the topic of the talk this evening, the Scots Army 1660 to 85, police force or failure. And compared to its compatriots, the English and the Irish armies, okay, the Scots Army has had not so much coverage, and certainly, okay, part of the reason, okay, for writing, okay, my latest book, Monmouth's First Rebellion, was to try to alter that viewpoint and you know, look at it with a more of a visionist view indeed. So this evening, okay, obviously looking at the organisation, okay, behind the Scots Army, the tactics they use, their modus operandi, and indeed their service in the field and its legacy going on forward as well, because I personally think, okay, that a number of lessons or problems that they encountered during the Covenantal rebellions later on, okay, would have a direct impact on how government armies in Scotland would deal with the Jacobite campaigns moving forward as well. So to start off with, okay, obviously, if you talk to anyone in Scotland, okay, about redcoats, apart from a passing comment about Skegness, they are likely to say, okay, you know, that the redcoats represents a repressive, brutal, antagonistic soldier from the 18th century. They defeated the Jacobites at Culloden. And no image, you know, represents this more than Morier's depiction of an event from the 1745 rebellion, although, you know, latterly we think it does directly depict the Battle of Culloden, fought on the 14th of April, 1745. And while we could go into the, you know, how good or bad an image it is, and it is, you know, generally quite historically accurate, it does act as historical shorthand for representations publicly of the redcoat within Scotland. Although certainly, okay, this reputation, okay, for being heavy-handed goes back way before the Jacobite rebellions, way before 1745, and really can see its genesis in the wake of the civil wars from the 1660s onwards. Equally, we can look at the Highlanders in the image, and they are seen as brutal, as backward, as being a bit unkempt as well. And, you know, while that might be a generalistic image of depictions of the Highlanders, certainly it's also an image that is created in the wake of the civil wars as well, because, of course, supplementing the Scots Army going forward, you have the Highland host, and certainly their ill treatment of people in Presbyterians in southwest Scotland, I feel probably had a direct result on recruitment for the Jacobite armies moving south in late 1745 as well. So there's something to be learned, okay, on both sides of the divide in terms of representations of the Jacobites from the original Scots Army. Now, of course, study of the Scots Army, the most major piece of study is Charles Dalton's 1890 study of the Scots Army from 61 to 88. And while it is good as a list of officers, of muster lists, of biographies of the various commanders of that army, looking at how that army actually functioned, it does fall somewhat short. And of course, the most recent study of the Scots Army, Stuart Reid's Partisan Press pamphlet, while it had the opportunity, to be, quite revisionist and open that subject up, very much is a rehash of Dalton's work as well, and that is something I hope to redress, with the book and lastly with this lecture as well. Now, civil wars never end tidily, and with the restoration of the monarchy in 1660, it was felt, certainly within Scotland, that there would be immediate compromise to impose the political and religious status quo. Certainly it had worked well under the interregnum. Why should there be a change if you're going to keep the pace moving on from 1660? And so both Covenantal Whig, and Whig comes from the words, for Highland cattle drover, a Whigamore, because Wigham is supposed to be the word they're supposed to call to their cattle as they're moving forward. Latterly come to be known as a reformer. Largely the Covenanters fall within this party. So the Covenanter Presbyterian Whig and the Royalists ultimately, would be made to be uneasy bedfellows. And in both state and army, immediately after the events of the Civil War, they ultimately became a melting pot of ideologies, with Presbyterian and Episcopalian, Catholic and Protestant, Anglican, all being thrown into the same mix. And ultimately, all this did was create a schism throughout society, a prime environment for sectarianism and violence to grow. Certainly, Charles II, the incoming king, despite being crowned by the Presbyterian Church in 1651 in the wake of the Battle of Dunbar, ultimately, going forward from the Restoration, was seen to be as uncompromising as his father. Certainly, we know Charles II as the King of Bling, the party king. He is a king that likes the pomp and ceremony, and certainly, his coronation was anything but that. And not only that, the Covenanters are unsuccessful at the battles of Dunbar and Worcester that are supposed to put Charles back on the throne. Ultimately, he felt he didn't have anything to owe to them because they reneged on their side of the deal, really. So certainly, he had an axe to grind. And so from November of 1661, there was a move throughout Scotland to impose a pre-1638 religious practice. And this started with the introduction of a new Book of Common Prayer imposed on the High Kirk. Obviously, Charles hadn't learned from the pushback that his father had received in St. Giles in Edinburgh in 1638. And ultimately, as a result, the Covenanter Presbyterians that had relative religious freedom, right from 1638 to 1660, they immediately feel persecuted. And for many, it was an opportunity, in trying to push back against this, to enact personal grievances as well. Now, ultimately, into the melee in trying to keep the peace around Scotland comes the Scots Army as well. What kind of force are we talking about? What was the quality of it? Who better to ask than the command of the Scots Army in 1689 during the First Jacobite Rebellion, General Hugh Mackay of Scowry, had previously served within the Dutch Scots Brigade within the Dutch Army, and latterly after the Covenanter Rebellions be defeated at Killiecrankie in July of 1689, would go to serve in Ireland, fight at the Battle of Landen, and get killed at Steenkirk in 1692 as well. And what he says about the quality of the soldiers that he inherits in 1688 leaves little to be desired. So, for example, the officer corps, Mackay says about them, there is a great want of experienced officers, the chief officers being all noblemen of no service, chose the officers of their regiments and troops, according as they had a kindness for their persons or as they judged them popular. Now, nepotism and indeed unprofessional officers in a late 17th, 18th century, even a 19th century army is not unique. But certainly, okay, the fact, okay, that at the top of this statement, Mackay puts it front and center, shows that particularly within the Scots Army, okay, there is certainly a lack of professionalism. These officers are being put into position, okay, for status, and ultimately, okay, as is going to become clear, use that status to impose their own personal grudges and family feuds as well. As for the other ranks, Mackay says the foot regiments which I see at Stirling are in bad condition. Little boys and tired old men had so little skill in placing their matchlocks true and scarce, 1 in 4 could fire their pieces off. And those that did thought that they had done a great feat if the gun fired at all, not minding what they shot at. So not only do they have a lack of training, but the recruiters are also bringing in the wrong kinds of people, okay, for military service as well. So a paltry force to be worked with. And as for the army as a whole, all our officers and soldiers were strangers to their way of fighting and in battling, which mainly occasioned the consternations many of them were in. So ultimately, okay, a very, very ragtag, very amateur force indeed. What Mackay does say after this, though, and is quite telling, is he does say that ultimately by drawing the people from the locality, from local knowledge, such sectarianism that they would be impacting upon the prosecuted, it could be applied to rooting out refuges of insurrection as well. So local knowledge is always good. Now, the Scots Army, although the news sheets and the pamphlets of the time do highlight it as, being up to 10, 15,000 strong, if you look at the muster reports for that army, as well as reports given to the likes of Lord Lauderdale, the main commissioner in the Scots Parliament, that is a number that has been well and truly inflated. It was never a reality. Rather, okay, the Scots Army, okay, if it was put in the field and its total numbers never really exceeded any more than about 3,000 to 4,000 men indeed. And of those regiments, barely a quarter of them are regular soldiers, mainly from the Guards regiments, and regiments that are raised from fencibles and put into the line as well. Very, very few regular soldiers in that army as well, largely supplemented by militia, independent companies, and loyalist Highlanders of the Highland Host as well. And on the one hand, this is partly due to a shrinking Scottish economy. In the late 17th century, there's a definite economic depression within Scotland, but also equally mirrors the distrust by Parliament, by people, of continuous standing armies in post-Civil War Britain as well. So in terms of regular soldiers, there's only really one regular regiment within the Scots Army of Infantry, that's the Scots Guards. There are other regiments, such as the Earl of Mar's Greybreeks, which is raised from a militia regiment into a line regiment just before the 1679 Covenanter Rising, and is latterly made into a regiment of Fusiliers going forward as well. Most of these regular regiments are identified uniformity by having Dutch coats lined in white as well. Those are mainly the regular regiments. 3/4 of the army, though, were mostly made up of militia, and they're often relegated to garrison duty. Certainly, okay, there is accounts given to the likes of Lauderdale and other officers within the Scots Army that says there's a definite lack of up-to-date arms within the militia regiments as well. Some of them are armed with muskets, whether that be matchlocks or flintlock firelocks. Some have pikes. A lot of those regiments are turning up to muster, okay, with what they can get hold of. So pitchforks, lock-up axes, anything that can be fashioned as a military weapon as well. But as a means of raising an army, it's a good way of mitigating the Scottish economy. Raise a regiment of militia, use them for the time they're needed, and then disband them again afterwards as well. And certainly, okay, the population of Scotland, there's good incentives for joining the militia. You're exempted from taxation. You get 6 shillings a day, okay, for your service. So, you can make quite good money out of it. The officers of the militia regiments, largely professional, although, how you rate professionalism, is, it's always subjective. But certainly, the rank and file, how much that we can call them trained soldiers is up for debate. Certainly got about 4 days worth of training a month. That would usually be a weekend muster where you would gather in a particular area of the county, wait for all your friends to turn up. You'll have a party in the meantime, get completely utterly sozzled. By the time everyone is there to do some proper training, you're in no fit state to do that whatsoever. So certainly variable qualities amongst the militia as well. You'll also notice that the East Midlothian militia, as depicted here, are shown in blue coats lined white. That would not have been uniform across the militia. We know for a fact that the East Lothian militia and the Edinburgh militia as well were made up prior to 1678 with disbanded soldiers from Sir William Lockhart's regiment of foot as well. They had been dressed in blue coats lined white and obviously were taken along by those disbanded soldiers into these regiments. The problem is that the Victorians later on, writing ballads about the Covenanter Rebellion, they mention in one particular ballad about the Battle of Bothwell Brig, the militia were all wearing blue coats as well. It's probably not the case. The Ayrshire regiment was wearing red coat lined yellow, and certainly other regiments would have been wearing what they wore every other day of the week as well. So certainly no uniformity amongst the militia. Now, supplementing the militia, of course, you also have the Highland host, anywhere up to 5,000–6,000 in strength, made up from loyalist clans from the Highlands, the likes of the Atholls, the Murrays, the Campbells, and they'd initially been raised to suppress the freshened mutiny amongst the Argyll and Clydesdale militias in 1676 as well. And they're based around companies of 150 clansmen. Again, probably not uniform in makeup. Certainly, there is an approach to trying to uniform them in about 1678, 69 with red coats, but largely wearing their typical clan plaid and dress as well. Certainly not as spectacular as the image of the Highland host seen here on the right, Mungo Murray of Athol, who led the Highland host at the Battle of Bothwell Brig in 1679 as well. Probably a lot more plainer than that. Obviously, cavalry within the Scots Army. You've got the Royal Dragoons, the Scots Greys, probably named not because their mounts were grey mounts at the time, but probably because they're wearing hodden grey coats at the time. There is a disagreement over the choice of headgear, whether it's broad-brimmed hats or dragoons' hats. They may well, there's an account in Captain James Crichton's memoir of the later rebellions of them wearing blue bonnets, and such a choice, with the colour of their coats, would have been a very, very good choice for counter-insurgency works amongst the Covenanters. It would have allowed them to fit in with the local fashion as well. But certainly, the other regiments of horse within the army, so regiments like the Scots Troop of Horse Guards and indeed the Royal Regiment of Horse would have worn the typical red coats with white facings as well. And lastly, but not least, the Scots train of artillery, just like into the 18th and 19th century, separate from the English Ordnance Board. They were under the command of the chief engineer within Scotland, one Lieutenant John Slessor, who would gain fame later on for revising and redesigning the defences at Stirling and Edinburgh Castle as well. Now, the artillery train would have been housed at arsenals and magazines at Edinburgh and Glasgow and Stirling. And on paper, at least, it consisted of 8 minions, demi-culverins, and culverins as well. But by 1678, again with underfunding as well, this has shrunk to about 4 guns in variable states of repair, and they're manned by about 4 inexperienced gunners as well. And I think it shows how inexperienced they are. At the Battle of Bothwell Brig, the gunners fire off 1 volley, are fired on by the Covenanters, and immediately run away from their guns as well. So they look impressive in terms of uniform, but in terms of ability, very much lacking indeed. So in terms of what the Scots Army was forced to impress, from 1664 there was something called the Act of Indulgence passed, and this is passed not only against Catholics within Scotland, but also against nonconformist sects that aren't Episcopalian as well. So that includes Presbyterians, Fifth Monarchy men, Quakers. If you are a minority religious sect, okay, is aimed at you. And what the document basically ensures is that the perpetrator signs a document saying that the Crown is the head of the church as well. And if you don't attend an Episcopalian service, it will result in fines being levied on your household of up to a quarter year's wages as well. And what that does is that people, who are not of the Episcopalian viewpoint, they're immediately labelled as fanatics within society. It pushes them out of their houses, out of their churches, sends them into exile, and a lot of those adherents go and form a Presbyterian church in Rotterdam, which going forward will be a seat for militant action and pamphleteering propaganda going forward as well. So certainly a seat of rebellion is created pretty quickly. So how ultimately can the Scots Army suppress this? Well, as I said, there's, taking some theory, there's a number of ways they can do it. Clausewitz, later than the Covenanter Rebellions, argues you've got to immediately remove the supply, to that insurgency. You've got to isolate the insurrection. Certainly, ravaging Presbyterian and Covenanter households, seizing armories and arms stores, and intercepting arms being sent over from Ireland and also from Holland as well. That's one way of doing it as well. The Covey, on the other hand, again, the Napoleonic theorist, says you've got to be quick, you've got to be sharp, you've got to be brutal. It has to be a war of extermination. But ultimately, the Covenanters are, so embedded within local societies that you try and pull them out and try and persecute them, it's only going to worsen dissent. It provides a means of motivating. Modern counterinsurgency argues you've got to do hearts and minds. You've got to provide a better alternative, to rebelling against the government. So what the government and indeed the Scots Army puts forward going forward is, limited religious freedom. Sign an indulgence. We don't have to impress upon you. You'll be absolutely fine. And indeed, a superiority of force. You want a 20-to-1 superiority. Problem is that the Covenanters don't number any more than about 4,000, 5,000 fighting people, about the same size as the Scots Army as well. So it's never anything that you can put in place as well. And certainly, although on paper the Scots Army has a strength of about 22,000 men from about 1667 to repeal and push back Dutch incursions on the 4th, that was never going to be met whatsoever. And if it had been risen to that number, it would have been divided by sectarian division as well. Ultimately, the method, that the Scots Army mainly adheres to, is entrapment. So forcing further radicalization to entice Covenanters into increasingly violent militant acts as well. So, taking itinerant ministers, imprisoning them for not giving up fugitives, within the congregation, casting them out their ministries, being more violent, than the Covenanters, and as a result, what that's going to do is it's going to force the Covenanters to take direct action as well. And certainly, many of those fugitives, if they're not doing direct action in Scotland, are going over to Holland, fomenting unrest there, in Scotland as well, and would go on, to serve in the Argyll Monmouth Rebellions in 1685, and also the Rye House plot as well. The other way they do it is they ultimately remove leaders, imprison the main ringleaders for the Covenanter movement, and by doing that, hopefully limiting organisation and publicity. Problem with doing that, you create the cult of the martyr as well. You go to any town throughout southwest Scotland, go into the graveyard, there'll be big memorials for Covenanter martyrs there as well. So ultimately, it's got to be a combination of all these factors in order to try and suppress them. The one that the Highland Host, really relies on is something called free quarter, and basically what this would be imposing, 10 to 20 soldiers on one household, and the household is required to support those soldiers at a rate of 8 to 10 pence per man per day. And these would be recusant households, okay, that had not attended an Episcopalian church as well. And, while this, could, if you were to take a step back, be looked upon as a, relatively benevolent move, quickly get the people to pay up. On the other hand, Mackay says, that amongst the Highland host, self-interest lay at the bottom. They served more for plunder than affection for the service. And certainly they created such a bad reputation for themselves, as I said, in the lowlands, as we've already said, that the Jacobites trying to move southwards in late 1745 find that there's limited recruitment potential because they've gained amongst the Highlanders such a bad reputation all the way back in the 1660s and 1670s as well. Ultimately, this could only flare up into violence. And this happened on 1st November 1666, when Sir James Turner, royalist military theorist, okay, who'd served in the Scots Royalist Army during the Civil War, was the author of the military treatise Pallas Armata. He is sent with the Scots Guards into Kilmarnockshire, looking for suspects, beating up quarters who are involved in a raid on the Air Armory as well. And he billets his soldiers in and around Dumfries. And one night, Corporal George Deans, with a section of soldiers, apprehends a passing farmer, supposedly called Greer. And he, A, refuses to sign the indulgence, but B, also refuses to give up his corn in his cart as well. And the soldiers ultimately threaten him with torture. They threaten to grill him over a griddle. I don't know whether that's, Victorians, sensationalizing it, but certainly they maltreat him, and a local hue and cry is raised as well. And in the morning, okay, the garrison wakes up to find that there's an armed force of 1,500 Covenanters outside of Dumfries. Deans and his section are captured, Dumfries is taken, and Turner captured in his bedclothes as well. Ultimately, the Scots government had to respond, and the person put down to respond to this, okay, was General Tam Dalyell of the Binns. And Tam Dalyell, if you know Scots history, is a bit of a boogeyman. He had served at the Battle of Dunbar, had been captured at the Battle of Worcester, refused to cut his beard as penance for his countrymen's involvement in the killing of the king in 1649. And then after the Civil War, goes off and serves in the Muscovite army in Russia. And indeed gains a reputation over there for being so repressive that in the 1950s, Stalin gave the Order of Lenin to the Dalyell family for their ancestors' repressive nature in Russia as well. And certainly as we go forward, we can see he brought a lot of that back with him as well. And certainly, there's also a story. It's always, everyone loves to hear this story. There is a story that one night at his home at the House of the Binns, just outside of Edinburgh, he was playing cards against the devil and cheats basically and beats the devil. The devil in a rage grabs hold of a marble table, throws it out the window into the moat. And everyone thought this was an apocryphal story, that there was no truth to it, until they dredged the moat of the House of the Binns in the 1880s, and lo and behold, there's a marble table at the bottom of the moat as well. So maybe a bit of a devil worshipper as well. Maybe it's just the public demonizing. Whatever the case, though, he starts to put in measures to put down the Covenanters. He put stop lines in place initially at Stirling Bridge and Queensferry to initially isolate the movement of the Covenanters throughout the country, and then musters the Scots Army, numbering about 3,000 men at Glasgow, and chases the dwindling Covenanter force into the hinterland, away from Edinburgh, and into the Pentland Hills as well. And although 17th century armies are slowed by infantry, initially it's Dale's cavalry, okay, that is harrying the Covenanters, beating up their quarters at Lanark, Colinton, and Bellshill, before finally pinning them down at Running Green on the 28th of November. Now, despite having a superiority of numbers within the government army, the Covenanters initially managed to push the government horse back on both flanks. And it was only the arrival of the infantry at about 4:30 in the afternoon on a late winter's day that Dale was able to pivot his line and use the mass firepower of the infantry to break up the Covenanter force as well. Once the infantry had arrived, the battle didn't last more than about 15 minutes or so. Whether it was darkness or sheerly indiscipline amongst the Covenanter ranks breaking them, we don't really know. Revenge, though, for the Penton Risings was swift in coming. 30 were executed for passive participation in the rebellion, 50 transported to Barbados. Certainly at the time, probably not a very good sentence, sent to serve in a sugar plantation in the Bahamas. You could get a jack there. Maybe today, okay, it wouldn't be so bad. But certainly 52 are also sentenced in absentia, and the likes of Dale and his second in command, William Drummond, were appropriating lands of absent and recusant Presbyterians and bringing it into their own fold as well. So certainly corruption within not only the Scots government, but the Scots Army was rife as well. And yet, despite all these repressive measures, reports of hedgerow ministers holding conventicles in the middle of nowhere, mass prayer meetings where everyone in the local area joins, that's the Presbyterian Convention. Ultimately, reports of these going on, continue to grow, and ultimately stories and rumours of how repressive it is are leaking back to the Scots government, down to the Parliament in England, and even as high as the King himself. And so there was a move going forward, roughly from about 1668 onwards, for a more tactile approach to solving this problem as well, with concession, compassion, and tolerance. And so on the 4th of March 1674, an Act of Grace is basically passed, basically an act of oblivion. Any Penton fugitives that are not now been captured, they were allowed to go free, basically. An indulgence was created to restore local ministers, to which 200 ministers sign it. And even conventicles, which had been seen as anathema to the Episcopalian Church, you can even get a license to hold those as well. So it looks like a move in the right direction. The problem is that the 1669 Assertory Act immediately undercuts this, and this is an act that basically says that once a Presbyterian ministry becomes vacant, it should be replaced by an Episcopalian minister, and ultimately it undercuts any positive moves forward as well. And conventicles and militant movements are increased exponentially. So by 1678, as many as 1 in 5 Scottish inhabitants supported the Covenanter cause as well. And certainly the main adherents of their prosecution, the likes of Archbishop James Sharp of St Andrews and the Bishop of Orkney, they immediately responded by ravaging Ayr, Clydesdale, Dumfries, Fife and Stirlingshire, the hotbeds of resistance, trying to break down this kind of worship, and in the process extracted over £3 million in indulgences as well. And as before, all this did was it increased the Covenanter insurgency and increasingly forced them to resort to assassination and direct action as well. This all culminates in the 1679 Covenanter Rising, and it bursts into life on the 1st of May 1679 when Archbishop James Sharp is in carriage outside of St Andrews early one morning with the Bishop of Orkney and his daughter, is ambushed by 13 assassins. There's a running battle. The assassins shoot the horses before dragging Archbishop Sharp out of the carriage and summarily executing him as well. And certainly, it's a more violent act than the Covenanters had previously adhered to. They saw James Sharp as being a bit of a hypocrite. He'd previously been the chaplain general for the Covenanter army in 1650 and 1651, and had been a great adherent to Presbyterian worship as well. So he was a primary target for their unrest. At the same time, the Queensferry Militia, many of whom were Presbyterians amongst their ranks, they mutiny. Government officers are kidnapped. There's pistols fired into a barracks at Falkirk, and armed conventicles are being raised as well. So prayer meetings where they've got a body of armed men defending them. the government forces come along to try and suppress them, and they see them off there as well. And certainly there's a clear intent of violence on 29th of May 1679 with the Rutherglen Declaration, where the assassins to James Sharp march right into Rutherglen. It's the king's birthday, so already there's some symbolism to it. They tear the indulgence from the market cross and nail up their own declaration, basically saying they intend to impose universal Presbyterianism throughout Scotland, while at the same time excommunicating the whole of the royal family as well. So Charles II, the Duke of York, the Duke of Monmouth, and anyone else that stood in their way as well. So a definite declaration of war. Into the breach steps this man right here. This is John Graham of Claverhouse, the commanding officer of the Royal Regiment of Horse within the Scots Army. Previously, once again, served in the Dutch Army in William of Orange's Blue Guards, had been superseded for command of that regiment by Hugh Mackay, came home, started commanding the Scots cavalry within the Scots Army, and obviously going forward would be the command of the Jacobite forces in the 1689 Jacobite Rising as well. Bonnie Dundee, of course, to his Jacobite supporters, bloody clavers to his Covenanter Presbyterian detractors as well. He would ultimately go on to be, the major bully boy, for the government in repressing Covenanter worship throughout Scotland. Now, news reached Claverhouse at Glasgow, that the Covenanters intended to hold a mass conventicle at Loudon Hill for the 1st of June 1679. And so he, with a squadron of Royal Horse and also the Scott Greys, was sent to suppress it. They march through Straven, the local town, capture one of the commanders of the Covenanter force, Minister John King, in his cups outside the local tavern, and then ride on to Loudon Hill to find out that the conventicle, the congregation, has moved about a mile northwards towards Drumclog as well. And Claverhouse arrives to find that the congregation is on the hill. They're having a service, they're singing psalms, and so he immediately tries to break this up by sending across a full-on hope, taking pot shots at the Covenanter congregation, while possibly also using his Covenanter prisoners as human shields in front of his line as well. When that doesn't work, he sends across his whole line across a coal-wicking burn, and ultimately overextends his force, and is met with an unexpected Covenanter volley, followed by a charge. Claverhouse is forced back, is forced into a defensive ring, his colours are captured, and surrounded on all sides, Claverhouse is overwhelmed and is forced to perform a fighting retreat, firstly to Straven, and then onwards from there to Glasgow as well. The following day, the Covenanters take the unprecedented move of trying to take Glasgow. They need to secure it as a power base, firstly, to make sure their campaign can continue, but also to gain hold of the arms stored within the armories there as well. Certainly, although they had arms from those that were dropped, by the government forces at Drumclog the previous day, they still were largely armed with scythes, with pitchforks, with rockable axes. Firearms are in the minority within the Covenanter camp. Pre-warned, the garrison commander, the Earl of Linlithgow, barricaded the Gallowgate and University Quarter, and he created a layered defence in depth that would ultimately ward off the Covenanters. But in the same sense, and keep this in mind, it did give the Covenanters experience in urban fighting as well. That would do them good later on in 1689 as well. We will come back to that later on. Ultimately, though, Linlithgow feels that being in Glasgow, despite seeing off the Covenanters who are pushed back to Bothwell Brig, ultimately he feels he's in too isolated a position. And so with the rest of the Scots Army, he retires firstly to Stirling and then onwards to Edinburgh. Firstly, to gain control of the trains of artillery from the magazines there, but also marching towards the border, because in the meantime, Tyrones and Scots Foot from the Irish army and the Oxford Horse from the English army have been moved up in support if mass insurrection breaks out in Scotland as well. And don't think at this time, okay, that the government army is purely being defensive, because Claverhouse is continuing beating up the Covenanter camps and quarters, firstly at Bewley Bog and then lastly at Bothwell Brig as well. Rather than going on an offensive campaign, the Covenanters have basically sat down at Bothwell Brig and decided to have a convention where they debate ultimately, okay, the direction that the Covenanter cause should go forward. And certainly the eve of the Battle of Bothwell Brig, they actually purged their officer corps of those, okay, who have previously signed the indulgence, because they deem that a sin against God, and because of that sin, that's the reason why they've lost at Glasgow as well. So, the logic in that, okay, is what it is. But certainly, we're not talking about a first-rate army here. We're talking about a second, third, even fourth-rate army. But now news of the Covenanter Rebellion has reached London, and Charles II sends his eldest illegitimate son, the Duke of Monmouth, northwards, ultimately to put it down. Monmouth, experienced commander, had commanded the English brigade in the French and the Dutch armies, was the hero of Maastricht and St. Denis, and certainly, okay, would go on to lead the Monmouth Rebellion in the West Country in July of 1685 as well. Certainly, okay, we won't cover it in the talk here today, but a lot of what Monmouth experiences with the Covenanters, I do feel, okay, directly influences his tactics and his approach to leading the West Country Rebellion going forward as well. But he leads north, okay, a brigade of horse guards and immediately takes command of the Scots Army. He musters the Scots Militia, despite Tam Dalyell's protestations, at Blackburn on the 18th of June, and on the 19th joins forces with the Nithgo at Bonny Bridge, just outside of Stirling as well. And on this way, he's carrying out a scorched earth policy. He's gathering in all the livestock, denying food to the Covenanters as well. 21st of June, a Wednesday, okay, the government forces make contact with the Covenanters at Bothwell Brig. And while both sides camp that night, Monmouth secretly sends across an emissary, John Miller of Watersow, to bring terms of parley and surrender to the Covenanter camp. He's appealing to the family values within the Covenanter army, as Miller was also a brother-in-law to one of the ministers in the Covenanter Council of War as well. And the terms that Monmouth gives are quite lenient. He's basically saying, put down your arms, we don't want any effusion of blood right here. If you do this, we will talk, and I will personally represent you within the Scots Parliament as having every third ministry in Scotland being a place for Presbyterian worship as well. Certainly, with the government forces, previous track record of dealing with the Covenanters, Monmouth is quite lenient. Now, whether he's doing this, with any mandate from the English or the Scots Parliament, is debatable. Certainly, okay, he may well be taking a lenient course to gain a power base, to gain support within the Covenanter cause, within Scotland, for possible grab for the throne going forward in 1685 as well. It might be, okay, that other people, other grandees within the Scots Parliament, besides the Lord Lauderdale, have realised, we can't keep on with these repressive measures. We don't really know. But ultimately, the Covenanters generally, they dismiss them. They laugh in John Miller's face and say, what, and hang next, basically. So they're not buying it. To deal with Monmouth, okay, is to deal with the main perpetrator of their persecution as well. So, fighting starts at Bothwell Brig at about 3 o'clock in the morning of the 22nd of June, 1679. And initially, okay, the government forces try to get around the flank of the Covenanters in the foreground of the picture below the bridge by sending a party of Scots Greys across the ford. But they're seen from the bridge and shots are fired out by David Haxton's company on the bridge, and they're forced back to their lines. There is a firefight that continues throughout the morning, okay, between the garrison of the bridge and the government line. And ultimately, okay, the rate of fire, okay, that is presented from the bridge ultimately forces the gunners away from their guns, allowing the Covenanters to capture one of the guns as well. However, okay, it's only with the Covenanters running short on powder that the government forces can start to dislodge them as well. And a party of foot guards and dragoons are sent across the bridge to try and dislodge them. They, in turn, though, get pinned down in the houses at the far end, and ultimately, okay, weight of fire from the government line allows the gunners to reman their guns and to start to use that weight of firepower to dislodge Covenanters from the houses on the far side of the bridge and allow the foot guards to continue marching on as well. Monmouth marched across the bridge, and on the far side, he tripled his frontage, increasing the level of firepower that could be brought to bear on the Covenanter forces as well. However, just like at Rullion Green, cavalry under Thomas Torfoot on either flank of Brownlee, the cavalry on the Covenanter side, they push back the government forces, and it's only enfilading fire from the Scots Greys and the Highland host on the flanks that starts to roll up the Covenanter army as well. Ultimately, once that firing starts to take hold, the Covenanters don't stand more than 20 minutes before breaking into a full rout. During the course of that fighting, anywhere between 400 and 800 Covenanters are killed, and 12 to 1,500 are captured, including at least 2 of the ringleaders for the rebellion as well. They are transported to Greyfriars Kirk in Edinburgh, where they're kept in the Covenanter prison. Basically, it's a vault, okay, within the graveyard, which measures anywhere in the region of about 30 feet by about 3 feet across as well. So imagine the Black Hole of Calcutta. It would have been absolutely horrific there. Monmouth was seen, though, riding across the battlefield in the aftermath of the fighting, calling for quarter, sending his own physician and food to the wounded of both sides as well. Now, that might have been the fact that he was accompanied all the way by Anne, the Duchess of Hamilton. He may well have been having an affair with her. It may well have been a case that he wanted the rout to stop because her husband, the Duke of Hamilton, was haranguing him about the Covenanters and the horse ruining his prime parkland as well. We don't really know. But again, Monmouth showing quite a lenient side to repression as well. Yet, despite an indication of a more moderate standpoint by the Scots government and army moving forward under Monmouth's guidance, this was to be very short-lived indeed. And enter the pantomime boogeyman again. Tam Dalyell, he appears just as the fighting is ending, and seeing Monmouth, treating with the Covenanters so light-handedly, he sends letters on to the King, to the Duke of York, to the government, basically saying, Monmouth is too soft. And as a result of this, Monmouth is immediately dismissed, and the Duke of York appointed as the main commissioner in Scotland to ultimately put down even more repressive measures under the Scots Army as well. Indeed, Dale said, these rogues should never have troubled His Majesty or the kingdom anymore. And indeed, okay, it will be Dale and it will be Claverhouse, okay, who are the main perpetrators of the killing times as well. Starting to summarily execute priests, okay, without trial, running down families, and indeed, when they are taking prisoners, applying the more shallow means of torture, using thumbnails and the boot, okay, to try and exact, okay, where their fellow Covenanters are hiding as well. So very, very brutal measures being undertaken. With increased aggression against the Covenanters and fugitives of Bothwell Brig, the newly styled Cameronians, who were fugitives from the Battle of Bothwell Brig under the Protestant minister Richard Cameron, became even more radicalised and violent. And with support from the Dutch government, had landed in Scotland in 1680, increased their levels of declarations. Not now saying that the royal family should be excommunicated, but rather that they should be executed as well. and trying to put this down, bodies such as Captain James Crichton's troop of Scots Horse Guards started adopting local dress, hodden coats, grey Scots bonnets, in order to infiltrate these meetings as well. Ultimately, the Cameronians were put down very, very quickly at the Battle of Ayers Moss in July 1680. Yet, with continued repression, the only place, that the Covenanters ultimately, could find solace, was by going into exile, going to Rotterdam, and some of them indeed did enlist in the Dutch army as well. And it is very telling, that when William of Orange lands, at Torbay in 1689, a huge amount of the officers within his Blue Guard, largely are ex-Covenanters amongst them as well. Key amongst those members, is one Lieutenant Colonel William Clayland. Clayland, again, a veteran of Drumclog, Bothwell Brig and Ayers Moss, he would be put in command of the Earl of Angus's regiment that was moved into Dunkeld during the first Jacobite rising in 1689 as well. How effective he was in commanding that regiment, we don't really know. He's killed in the opening stages of the battle as well. But certainly within the Earl of Angus's regiment, they're now instituting Covenanters and Cameronians into the regular Scots Army as well. And indeed, although of that 600 strong garrison, 200 of them are only Cameronians, they are largely officered by Covenanters as well. And the Battle of Dunkeld, very much leans on sectarianism between Episcopalian Jacobite and Highlander and Presbyterian Covenanter, because indeed their opponents at the Battle of Dunkeld were largely Athelmen, who they'd faced at Bothwell Brig in 1679 as well. And certainly, one of the reasons I think, for how successful the Cameronians are in defending Dunkeld largely is borne out by their experience of urban fighting against at Glasgow in 1679. And certainly, a similar level of sectarianism, between Episcopalian and Covenanter is also responsible for the Glencoe massacre, and indeed going forward, as well, for various actions, during the three Jacobite rebellions that followed on from it. So ultimately, in conclusion, how does the Scots Army, better itself? Ultimately, if it's going to be a good peacekeeping force, for putting down such insurgencies, there needs to be a general unity of purpose between the politicians, the government, and the military as well. It needs to be better funded, and certainly, that is going to be starting to be implemented going forward from 1689 onwards as well, and certainly, onwards, from 1707, when the English army and the Scots army are amalgamated as well. There needs to be a strength of force as well. Having paltry little bodies of regiments, is never going to be able to police such a large area. Also, a better infrastructure network as well. Wade's military roads, ultimately the Covenanters are holding their conventicles in out of the way places. Wade makes those places accessible. Also, the use of regular fortified strong points, so armed forces can be brought out to put them down easily. But equally as well, integrating Jacobites, integrating Covenanters into the Scots Army allows them to be able to better understand the tactics being used by such small forces as well. And ultimately, relearning. Ultimately, throughout the period, from 1660 to 1675, as more Jacobite rebellions are happening, there is always a learning curve, at the beginning of the rebellion, where the Scots needs to adapt, to their opponents' tactics as well. So constantly learning, constantly taking on their own tactics to better adapt, to better police them, to better use them as well. If I have inspired, enlightened, entertained you, and you would like to learn more about the Scots Army, the Covenanter opponents, and the later Covenanter risings, much maligned, much forgotten outside of the Civil War, do please go and have a look at my brand new book, Monmouth's First Rebellion. It's available from Hillian and Company. It's also available on Amazon and all good bookshops as well. Thank you very much. Does anyone have any questions?
Boy, thank you very much indeed. I was waiting with bated breath the first mention of the Cameronians, who who marched off the square in 1968,
They did indeed.
ending 300 years of stroppiness in the British Army, and shortly after their last battle honour, which was the Battle of Minden in 1961 or 62, I think it was. And if you know what I'm talking about, you know what I'm talking about. And if you don't, it's why they became known in their last few years as the Poison Dwarfs. Anyway, I digress. There is a question. I hope there will be more questions flowing shortly. But Stephen asks, do any of the muster returns survive, giving details of what arms the members turned up carrying or what arms they were being issued with?
There is a couple of muster returns that do survive, certainly for the East Lothian Militia, and I think it's also the West Lothian Militia as well. I think they're in the minority. They do say, okay, that largely, okay, those are the regiments that are being supplied with firelocks, with muskets. They're in garrison. Every other regiment, though, there's not much record of it whatsoever. Although Lauderdale does mention in his state papers, okay, that you know, these regiments are very much undersupplied as well. So we do have surviving muster rolls for armaments for the East and West Lothian militias, but in terms of every other one, they don't exist. Everything else, okay, in terms of armament, okay, is coming from Lauderdale's papers as well. Thank
you. Mark asks, is there much toing and froing from the continent during this time?
There is certainly between Holland and Scotland as well. I didn't mention it that much during the talk, but throughout this period, there are Dutch fleets, Dutch incursions into the north of Scotland as well. So largely, okay, whether that's in support of the Covenanters or whether it's an independent thing, there's toing and froing. Certainly, okay, the Holland is the main place that people are going to as well. Certainly within England, before really 1685, there is a bit of movement towards the Low Countries in France as well, but Holland is the main person they're going to at this time as well.
We had a conversation a bit earlier, harking back to your masters. Is there much battlefield archaeology from this time in Scotland?
Not in Scotland, no. There's tons of archaeology for Culloden. There's tons of archaeology done for Bannockburn. In terms of the Civil War, there's been bits and pieces done for Dunbar in 1650, but no kind of widespread archaeology in terms of the 17th century. Obviously, down in England, you've got the Naseby survey, the Edge Hill survey, various bits and pieces done by Peter Newman over at Marston Moor. We've not been so lucky up here in Scotland. There was kind of a watching brief put in place as they were developing the inventory of historic Scottish battlefields back in 2006, 2007. Limited archaeology and field working done on the 17th century battles surveyed there, but nothing that you can take any major survey results from, really. So if anything, Dunbar is the one that they've done the most work on in terms of relating to our period. But Jacobites get a lot of press. Earlier stuff gets a lot of press. 17th century, as usual, is a bit unpopular.
What about the battlefields themselves? Are they largely built over?
They are. Well, no, they're not. So Bothwell Brig, the bridge no longer survives. It's now got an 1870s cast iron bridge that crosses over where the original bridge stood. A large amount of the battlefield have been obliterated by the local motorway that runs underneath it as well, part of the course. The only real position, that does survive is the position where the government gunners were placed, which is called Covenanters Field, and that's almost completely utterly untouched. We know for a fact there's a number of accounts that say that they have put up trenches and earthworks around their gun positions, but I can't find any records of that. So Bothwell Brig is quite heavily built over. Rutland Green, though, it's completely and utterly untouched. It's in the middle of Pentland, so it's an uphill area, so it's quite hard to get to. That's been completely and utterly untouched. And the same for Drumclog as well. Drumclog is pretty much untouched as well. There's a schoolhouse, okay, with a martyr's memorial in the middle of the battlefield. There's a road running through it as all. But apart from that, it's just farmland, so it's very, very well preserved. So Rutland Green in 1666, Drumclog in 1679, well preserved. Bothwell Brig almost completely eradicated.
Thank you. Stephen put up a comment,
Yes.
which was about facings. People
Yes.
just love uniforms, don't they? So from the deserters' notices in Scotland and England, the Scots Army facings were a lot more varied.
Yeah.
Although both the horse and foot guards had white, the Royal Horse had yellow, the Royal Dragoons had red, the Fusiliers had red, and Washops had yellow. Is this
right? So yes, my understanding, and I'm happy to be corrected about this, Stephen. Those regiments, okay, certain of the Fusiliers seem to have been adopted that colour facing after 1679. So it's the space between where they almost universally take up blue facings, okay, in 1685. So it's that period, kind of 1680 to 1683, 1684. I would assume, okay, the Scots are the other facings that you've presented there are in that small period as well. But certainly, okay, you've mentioned obviously the guards, have white. Royal Horse had yellow. I was aware of that. Claverhouse's horse for sure. The other regiments, walk-ups, I can't help feeling, okay, were not standing at the time of the Covenanter Rebellions, so wouldn't have been present. But certainly, okay, would have had yellow going forward as well. But yes, I was aware of those facing changes. Yeah.
This is just a personal question for me now. I mean, the London Scottish had the hodden grey kilt. You've mentioned that the Scots Greys possibly took their name not from their mounts, but from the hodden grey. What is hodden grey in terms of Scottish cloth?
Well, okay, how long do you have? To be brutally honest, I think everyone that hears that, okay, has a different opinion on that. Basically, it's an almost muddy grey, so to speak. But then it also depends on where you're looking as well, because you get about 5 different descriptions of hodden grey. Everyone has a different description of it as well, but definitely a muted grey colour is my best description of it.
Was it a sort of a material that was readily available?
Yeah, absolutely. It's undyed, and yeah, I said it's easily made, so to speak. So yeah.
Okay. Another question has come in. It's from Richard.
Yes.
How do you rate the Scots Army's performance in the Argyll Rebellion?
It is. Again, okay. I think they initially, okay, very, very bad, okay, and get pushed back a lot. By the time of Muirdyke, they're starting to get that act together and act as a unified force. But while there's these penny packet attacks like around Greenock and the likes, they are certainly, okay, they're very variable in quality. It takes some time for them to get that act together. But just like the army down in the West Country as well, okay, it takes them time to get that act together and think about what they're doing as well. Once they get their act together, and remember, we can't really call Argyll's force, a first-rate force. It's a second or third-rate force. Once they've got their heads around what they're doing, that's when they start to have an impact. But variable to start off with, good by the time it finishes.
Thank you. I think we've exhausted the questions. So on behalf of your dad, who's in the audience, and myself, I'd like to thank you on behalf of the Society Warwick, for giving us this talk this evening, which I found particularly interesting. It's a period I know something about, but it's a part of the British Army, well, not the British Army, but you know what I mean. But I knew very little about the Scots Army of the late 17th century. So thank you for what's been a very illuminating talk. And we haven't yet agreed the date for the November talk, but that will be published shortly. Thank you everybody who has signed up, who attended this evening or are watching this on recording. And with that, I will say good night to all. Good night.
Good night.